Okay, so the New York Times had a headline this week. Online schools are here to stay even after the pandemic. And somewhat predictably, there's kind of this tug of war between, is online schooling good for kids or not good for kids, or does it have to be in person? And the article kind of arrives at the obvious conclusion that online learning works for some students and not for others. But perhaps that obvious conclusion is the place to start, that different ways of learning work better for different students. And if we started there, where would we end up? I'm Stephanie Lepp. You are opening the Infant Lunchbox. And today we're going to get a fresh take on post-pandemic education. So here is an incredibly crude way to tell the story. Once upon a time, there was no such thing as school. School was life and life was school. And then the Industrial Revolution came along and we went 180 degrees in the opposite direction. Schools became industrialized. Schools were like factories, like churning out students. And then gradually we discovered that there were 360 degrees in the circle, and that maybe the circle is actually a sphere. And we developed everything from Montessori to Khan Academy to experiential learning to forest schools to unschooling, essentially everything in between the original no such thing as school to the industrial factory schools and everything in between. But for the most part, public education has kind of stayed relatively stuck in the industrialized factory school model. Hence the proliferation of charter schools and private schools that can experiment with all of these other educational possibilities. And then the pandemic came along, and public schools had to go remote and had to experiment, and perhaps created room for not a tug of war between different educational possibilities, but the integration of some online and some in person, depending on the situation. And so back to the original question, what if we started with the understanding that different students have different educational needs in terms of in-person and online and everything else, where would we end up? One way to visualize where we would end up is with what I call an integral matrix. We would end up with an integral matrix for education. What in the world is an integral matrix for education? Well, imagine a matrix, and along the top row are different types of schooling. Right? Montessori, apprenticeships, Khan Academy, forest schools, remote learning, like all the different types. Underneath are rows that tell you about how each type works. What is it about? How does it work? What's the ratio of teachers to students, et cetera, et cetera. So you kind of understand how these different types work. The second to bottom row articulates the kind of learners for whom this type of schooling works the best. Right? Does it work the best for kinesthetic learners or auditory learners or visual learners or introverts versus extroverts or students with disabilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So you get an understanding of the circumstances in which, for which types of students each type works best. And then let's say the bottom row has articulates the overall impact of that style on the learner and how it impacts, let's say, their love of learning. So to what extent do students enjoy learning with that learning style? To what extent does it make them want to learn more? Ultimately, what this kind of matrix, integral matrix for education does is it allows us to shift from a tug of war between remote versus in person or Montessori versus Waldorf or whatever it is to an actual snapshot, like admittedly probably somewhat rough, but like a rough sense of under what circumstances or for which type of learner does which type of education work best, with an eye towards using or moving towards the learning styles that that make students want to learn more, or maybe help them learn for themselves, like develop learning sovereignty. But thank you, tug of war, because what the tug of war is often doing is identifying the circumstances under which each type does not work very well. I mean, that's kind of what the tug of war is all about. It's like, no, but your kind does this. It's like, well, thank you, tug of war. You did the very important job of identifying the circumstance under which that type doesn't work. And now we want to aggregate all of these things we know into a snapshot of under which circumstances does which type work best, so we can use them all to help learners with different learning styles, basically. To learn more about the concept of an integral matrix and integral strategy in general, check out the Infinite Lunchbox episode called Leadership in Times of Crisis. I'm wearing purple in the thumbnail. Now, I am not equipped to make an integral matrix for education, but I do believe it can be done. And just as by way of example, here are a few things I think we might learn if we were to make an integral matrix for education. I think we would learn, and this might go without saying, but I think we would learn that students, and this is pertaining to the pandemic, students with disabilities or who get bullied a lot or are more introverted or even self-motivated would actually prefer remote learning. We would also learn, I think, that liberal arts colleges are and maybe even college in general is like a buffet. It's like for people who don't know exactly what they want, or for people who can afford to take the time kind of sampling a little bit of everything, because for students who do know what they want or can't afford to sample everything, they're just gonna go get it, through an apprenticeship or a trade school or some other kind of faster, cheaper way than a liberal arts college. So college or liberal arts colleges is probably a smaller use case than is currently the case in this country, which we actually do see reflected in other countries. Another thing we might learn from an integral matrix for education is that we can mix and match, right? It's not just like one or the other, but like some remote learning for this and some in-person learning for that and some Montessori for this and Waldorf for that. And ultimately we can mix and match different styles throughout our educational journey. And ultimately our educational journeys should be as diverse as we are, right? May the diversity of our educational journeys kind of reflect the diversity of us. A word that you will hear a lot around the Infinite Lunchbox is the word Christinity. Our current schooling situation is in crisis and also presents us with an opportunity, i.e. a Christinity, to develop a more integral approach to education. The fact that we're having to do this remote thing and it's not working for some people and it is working for others, and we might keep some of the remote thing when we go back online, is a Christinity to develop a more integral approach to education. And in my humble opinion, what determines whether it stays a crisis or is leveraged as a Christinity is not whether this integral approach kind of becomes available for the few, which I think will happen anyway. I think the few will enjoy experiencing a more integral education, in the sense that they can kind of mix and match and choose their own adventure. I think what determines whether it is a Christinity, whether it becomes a Christinity, is the extent to which that becomes available to the many. And so I would nudge us in the direction of how can integral education, how can these like choose your own adventure education, let's say, be implemented in a way that ensures that it's available to the many? How can equity, educational equity, be a universal part of all curricula, so that the way students learn can help more students learn in the ways that are suitable to them. Does that make sense? I hope so. How can more students learning in a way that is more tailored to them increasingly help more students learn in a way that is tailored to them? Anyway, two parting questions. One, in hindsight, what would have been the right educational journey for you? And two, how would you implement a kind of integral approach to education that would allow more students to experience it? I'm Stephanie Lepp. You have opened the Infinite Lunchbox. And if you dig it, please, 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 it really does matter. Click subscribe, click like, and click share, and share it with someone you love. Thank you.